I'm with Friends of Science Society. We do critical policy review on climate and energy topics, and we're a group of earth, atmospheric, and solar scientists and professional engineers. Lots of our people have actually had to implement some of these new technologies, so we have a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't. I have some information about us here, which I'd be happy if anyone picks them up later. So my topic is red ink and green subsidies. And I would like to open by reminding everyone that we are on Treaty 7 territory here. And in saying that, I'd like to mention that at the time that the Northwest Mounted Police came west, Canada had a defense budget, had an entire budget of $19 million a year. And in the United States, they were spending $19 million a year on Indian wars. And people, First Nations people in the West were being assassinated and slaughtered in the worst terrorist activities you can imagine by whiskey traders from the US, and the Mounties stopped that. So I'm saying that because this ties in with wind and solar, where people are now saying, oh, First Nations people should go into wind and solar because it's very much something that will help them progress economically, and I think that you'll find that's not the case. So it's called Red Ink and Green Subsidies. This is drawn from the work of Robert Lyman, who was a public servant for 27 years in Ottawa. He's now an Ottawa energy policy consultant. He also was a diplomat for 10 years. And this is on our blog. I hope that you would read it because I'm just going to do a very quick summary of his work and then set some context. So Dr. Mintz had mentioned that we're moving toward a low-carbon society. That's definitely not the case. As the CAP people pointed out, there is no such thing as a low-carbon society because everything is made from oil, gas, and coal. And we have to remember that as people tell us that this is such a great idea to go to wind and solar. So we're going to look at the overview that subsidies come in different forms. We're going to have a quick look at the U.S. overview and how effective that was. Budget 2017 and various Canadian programs, the preferential tax structures that these forms of energy have, ENGO proxies, budget 2018, we'll just have a quick look at that. Alberta coal phase out and going to natural gas is costing Alberta alone more than $30 billion. And that it's a flawed premise. And we'll look also at other drivers that Bill had just mentioned, pension funds, the UNPRI, and ENGOs. And I'll tell you that I'm in the red, and so are you. So let's go to the next one. What's a subsidy? Well, it can be many different types of things. You know, subsidies aren't always direct cash. There's lots of indirect subsidies, and we'll look at some of those now. So preferential treatment like funding of research and development, funding of technology, grants, contributions, low interest loans, preferential procurement, tax incentives, and being able to pass the benefits of tax incentives to outside investors with flow-through shares, preferential granting of regulations, above market utility rates, restrictions on local government abilities to impose property or other taxes on solar and wind project sites. That's a very big issue in Ontario. And these kinds of things happen at all three levels of government. So if we look at the United States, just look at the bottom line there. The subsidies for all renewable energy sources plus conservation in 2013 totaled $17 billion, or 58% of all U.S. federal spending on energy sources. And was it worth it? You'd think, wow, wind and solar must be driving the U.S. economy. But no, we find that solar is only 0.6% and wind providing only 4.7% of the energy, electrical energy. So if we look at budget 2017, the previous budget, there was $400 million over 5 years for sustainable development technology, $200 million over 4 years for clean tech, $950 million over 5 years supporting innovative sectors, $229 million over 4 years for R&D and clean tech and transportation. Then there was the Eco Energy for Renewable Power program. Before 2017, the largest source of federal government funding for renewable power sources was this program. It was launched in April of 2007 and would spend $1.4 billion and increase generation capacity by 4,500 megawatts, generation of 14 terawatt hours, by offering a refund of 1 cent per kilowatt hour to energy providers. So that's a lot of money back for something that doesn't really deliver power. And if we go to the next slide, so we essentially have about $2.4 billion out there for green. This is from budget 2017. So nearly $1.4 billion in new financing, $100 million as part of the Strategic Innovation Fund, $100 million for next generation smart grid, $200 million to support deployment, $220 million to subsidize the replacement of diesel fuel generators and put renewables in remote communities. That has a lot of risk to it. $182 million to develop and implement new building codes, and $14 million over 4 years for the clean technology data strategy. Wow, just, you know, $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty soon we're talking real money. So the Federation of Canadian Municipalities are also really into green. And this goes back to the ICLEI organization that was just mentioned by Bill. And so we've got 199 capital projects involving $88.6 million in grants, $671 million in loans, and Natural Resources Canada lists another 272 programs on their website. Quebec and Alberta refund and tax credits, so you could have tax credits for your house that from $2,500 up to $10,000 for solar and wind. The Alberta Residential Commercial Solar Program aims to have new solar panels on 10,000 rooftops in the province by 2020, despite the fact that anything north of the 35th latitude is an energy sink when it comes to solar. You basically have all your emissions in China. You're not reducing anything here. And the incentive is in the form of a rebate of 75 cents per watt, capped at $10,000. And green procurement. Wow, Ottawa is like the biggest buyer of services and products in the country, so why not procure everything green? That's a big, deep hole, and I'll let you read it. I'm sure this PowerPoint will be posted later. Okay, and we also have a preferential tax structure. So the oil sands used to get this accelerated capital gains, capital cost allowances, but the ENGOs complained that that was not fair. It was taking money from the taxpayer, but they don't mind it for wind and solar. It's just fine there. So this allows for, well, actually, I'll just let you read this yourself, because we're going to run out of time, I think. But by selling flow-through shares, the investor can recoup today in cash the present value of future tax savings, and the combination of 100% write-off in the year incurred plus flow-through shares marks an extremely generous treatment. I mean, can you believe that? Like, now you see why people like to put up wind farms. So basically, that's a quick summary of Robert Lyman's work. Now we're going to move into a bit of context. So we heard a bit about ENGOs. You've maybe read some of Vivian Krause's work. Here we find that Power Corporation out of Quebec has a number of subsidiaries in renewable energy, and Power Corporation has been funding the David Suzuki organization since 2007. We don't know how much they've been funding them, but that's a long time. And no surprise that David Suzuki Foundation submitted a proposal for wind to the Alberta Climate Panel, and voila, Power Corporation is building, well, one of their subsidiaries is building a wind farm in Jenner, Alberta. Now, we tried to challenge that. We wanted to have a public hearing, And the Alberta Utilities Commission, which says that it is an objective body acting on behalf of Albertans, refused us standing. You know, we have about 500 members and at least half of them live in Alberta. So that's like 200, 250 people who don't matter to the Alberta Utilities Commission. Anyway, so what is the present tax support for clean energy? Well, this was just tweeted the other day by Trevor Toome, so I haven't really gone through the new budget, but that gives you a quick inkling. So what's the fundamental problem with subsidies to wind and solar? Well, these incentives take so much more from the economy than they give back, because when you have wind and solar farms, it's not like when you have oil. When oil comes from the ground, it splits into many different product streams, creating many more jobs. And many different kinds of workers are required for oil, from development right to the end and ongoing regulation. And that's just not the case with wind and solar. So what is the source of all this drive to have wind and solar? We look at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You can see it in their summary for policymakers, 0.422. And they claim that decarbonizing, shutting down coal plants, is the best way to reduce carbon dioxide, and the best way to do it, they claim cost efficiently, is wide-scale renewables. Well, we wrote them a letter and asked them, you know, where's the evidence to prove that? Because everywhere that we've looked, wide-scale renewables are very, very expensive. And they said, we don't have that. And we told them that Google had tried an experiment to see if they could come up with cost-effective renewables. And we said, how about, did you refer to Google? They said, well, you know, if there was some peer-reviewed stuff out there, we would include it in our report. Well, there's been peer-reviewed stuff on how ineffective wind and solar are for decades. But obviously they prefer not to include it. And we can see, oops, if we just go back one, these are from the Ontario Professional Engineers, and they show the price rise in the cost of power in Ontario. And in the second small slide, they also explain that CO2 emissions actually go up past a certain level of implementation of wind and solar, because you actually have to have a natural gas plant running in the background to deal with all the erratic ups and downs of wind and solar. And that's what really costs the money. It's the back-end infrastructure. So if we look at the next slide. So why are we doing this? Again, this is the IPCC. This is evidence of our request to them. And we heard earlier, I just want to divert a bit on the carbon tax. We heard earlier that carbon taxes are effective. We already have 37 similar instruments in our government for reducing GHG emissions, and they're not very effective. So if all the people who signed on to the Paris Agreement met their targets, we would only reduce the warming by perhaps 0.17 degrees Celsius by 2030. So that's undetectable. Anyway, what is the cost to Alberta in decarbonizing? It's at least $30 billion. The government was very excited about the renewables auction because the price came in so low. They forgot to mention that you have to do all the coal to gas plant conversions. You have to build gas plant pipelines. You have to build new capacity in those pipelines to pump gas at the proper rate for when you're ramping up and down to meet the demands of wind, which is so erratic. So they forgot to mention these billions of dollars. They forgot to mention that the power purchasing contracts are costing us $2.25 billion in a loan that they took out to prop up the balancing pool. We're actually now importing coal power from Montana. We're buying it from Montana. Okay? So, and what's driving all of this? It's this organization called the UNPRI, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. It's a transnational, unelected, unaccountable organization. It's a group of activist institutional investors. It was founded by most of the pension funds that were mentioned today, plus many others, including the UN's own pension fund, which is kind of a nice way of self-dealing. And they have 6 principles that they rely upon. You've probably heard them bandied about from time to time: environment, social, governance. And so governance and social are all about diversity and about proper people on the board. They'd like to have climate risk included in every company's operation. And these are voluntary principles, but in principle number 6, you have to comply or explain, which is a kind of nice totalitarian thing. Now, they're activist investors, and they have affected policies in Canada and certainly in Alberta. A group of them, 120 of them, wrote a letter to the Premier on September 8th, 2015, saying that we should have a carbon tax, we should phase out coal, we should implement wind and solar. Basically, they gave the climate plan to the Alberta government, and they said, we have $4.6 trillion in assets, and this is what we think you should do. And that's what happened. So why is this happening? It doesn't really make any sense. If we look, imagine if you were an institutional investor and you had investments in various companies or mutual funds. You're invested in wind turbines, wind developer, transmission line, IT upgrades, smart meters, natural gas companies, pipeline developers, gas turbines, and all the other infrastructure that goes with it. What a great way to make money. You also get 20-year guaranteed subsidies, tax benefits, flow-through shares, and tradable renewable energy certificates. What a great way to recoup all the losses that you had on clean tech investments and the 2008 mortgage debacle. And who cares if it kills the golden goose taxpayer, because they're convinced they're saving the planet. Doesn't hurt them a bit. So clean tech losses, yes indeed. There's an article on the Wall Street Journal with Joseph Deere, who was the CIO of CalPERS. In 2013, he told them that clean tech was a noble way to lose money. They'd had 9.7% annualized losses for the past decade, and he called it an L for loser investment. And the only way to make money back, he said, was to either lower the cost of alternatives, that being wind and solar, or raise the price of carbon. So we see carbon prices have been implemented. All of these bankers, institutional investors are all pushing for a price on carbon, and they all keep saying that wind and solar are very cheap now. So wind and solar, unfortunately, cannot support even basic society. I invite everyone to read this paper by Professor Michael J. Kelly of the University of Cambridge, and you can see how ineffective wind and solar are. So I do have a short video here. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. On February 27, 2016, the G20 finance leaders announced from a UN Environment Program meeting in Shanghai that they're planning to spend more of your money. How much? Lots more. Well, it seems the G20 finance leaders are planning to mobilize $6 trillion a year. Not just until 2030, but till 2100. That would be $510 trillion, or over half a quadrillion dollars. That's kind of hard to get your head around. So we asked energy economist Robert Lyman to put that in more tangible terms that regular taxpayers could understand. How much is 500 trillion? If you can imagine $1 million and then you multiplied it 1 million times, then took that sum and multiplied it 500 times, that would be 500 trillion. Or how about this? There are 100 trillion cells in the average adult human body. So 5 of me, or 5 of you, in cells. Maybe you're the type of person who's born to shop. Imagine a shopper had to spend $20 per second, 24 hours a day, until all your money was exhausted. It would take you 1,585 years to spend 1 trillion. To spend 500 trillion would take you 792,500 years. And finally, 500 trillion seconds is about, 15 million years. So the amount of money that the G20 finance leaders are planning to spend, your money, is by any standard breathtaking. What's also breathtaking is the arrogance of those who would imagine that in the name of addressing an alleged climate problem about which there remains significant controversy, that governments would empower themselves to take this much money from their citizens, whether it's by regulation, taxation, or imposing costs on industry. And in turn, those costs are passed on to you, the consumer. And then they'd restructure every aspect of energy use and life to suit their vision. Frankly, the only way that this could be done would be through some kind of a global totalitarian government. Like, that sounds like scaremongering, but do you see any possible way that citizens would freely choose this option, regardless of how many sunny ways messages they were sent? Maybe it's no wonder that this UN G20 meeting got very little media coverage. But forewarned is forearmed. For Friends of Science, I'm Michelle Sterling. We have a new event coming up, and our event is going to be on May the 15th. We're going to have a young man named Marijn Pols from Holland who did a film about how people don't grow food anymore in Europe, they just grow wind farms, and what a food security risk that is and how much it's costing. And we're also going to have Dr. Madhav Kandekar, a climate scientist, former Environment Canada research scientist. He will be talking about climate extremes and how crazy it is that we in the West with 700 million people are fighting about climate change, when where he comes from in India, there are billions of people in the developing world who have nothing. So I thank you very much, and please come and get some brochures.